The first frost came early that year, silver-white across the stubbled fields where no one had planted wheat. Thomas Ashford stood at the edge of what had once been his father's land, watching the mist rise from the valley like the ghosts everyone said still wandered the battlefields across the channel. His breath hung in the cold October air, and for a moment, just a moment, he could almost believe the world had been made clean again, that the silence pressing down on the English countryside was the silence of peace rather than absence. The farmhouse behind him sat dark and empty. His mother had died while he was in France, of the influenza that had swept through the village like a second war, more efficient than all the shells and gas that had taken 4 years to do their work. His father had lasted until March, long enough to see Thomas return home with his medals and his limp and the dreams that woke him gasping in the small hours, long enough to grip his son's hand and whisper that the land was his now, that someone needed to remember how things had been. But Thomas had forgotten, or perhaps he had never known. The young man who had left for training in 1914 had understood plowing and harvest, had known the rhythm of seasons and the patient work of coaxing life from the soil. The man who had returned knew different things. How long a man could survive in a flooded trench, how the dawn looked when you knew you would be ordered over the top at 0 hour, how your best friend's blood looked spreading across the mud of no man's land. These were not useful skills for farming. The village of Aldermere lay 2 miles distant, a cluster of stone cottages and timber-framed buildings huddled around the Norman church where generations of Ashfords lay buried. Thomas had walked into the village twice since his father's funeral. Both times he had felt the weight of eyes upon him, the careful way people spoke around certain subjects, the mothers who still wore black for sons whose bodies had never come home. Mrs. Patterson at the post office had asked if he planned to work the farm. He had mumbled something non-committal and left before she could ask more questions. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The truth was, Thomas didn't know what he planned. The fields stretched away in all directions, 40 acres of land that his family had worked for 200 years, and he felt nothing when he looked at them except a vast echoing emptiness. The war had taken something from him that he couldn't name, some essential piece that had connected him to the earth and the seasons and the quiet satisfaction of a day's honest work. In its place, it had left this numbness, this sense of standing always slightly outside his own life, watching himself go through the motions like an actor who had forgotten his lines. He turned back toward the house as the sun began to break through the morning mist. The kitchen still smelled faintly of his father's pipe tobacco, though the old man had been dead for 7 months. Thomas put the kettle on the stove and stood staring at the blue flame, remembering how his mother used to make tea with such casual efficiency, her hands moving through the familiar ritual, while she talked about the day ahead, about the neighbors, about small matters that had once seemed important. The knock at the door startled him. Visitors were rare. He limped across the flagstone floor. The shrapnel wound in his left thigh ached in the cold weather, and opened the door to find a young woman standing on the step. She wore a dark coat and a simple hat, and her face was pale and serious. For a moment, Thomas couldn't place her, though something about her features seemed familiar. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't know if you remember me. I'm Eleanor Hartley. My brother was William Hartley. He served with you." The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. William Hartley. Billy, they had called him, though he had hated the nickname. A carpenter's son from the village, quick with a joke, always singing under his breath, even when they were up to their knees in freezing water. Billy had died at Passchendaele, torn apart by a shell that had landed directly in their trench. Thomas had been 3 feet away, had felt the concussion wave knock him backward, had spent the next hour helping to collect what remained of Billy Hartley and 2 other men into sandbags for burial. "Miss Hartley," Thomas managed. "Yes, of course. Please come in." She followed him into the kitchen, and he found himself absurdly conscious of the unwashed dishes in the sink. the newspapers stacked on the table, the general air of masculine neglect that had settled over the house. He poured tea with hands that were not entirely steady, grateful for something to do with them. "I'm sorry to intrude," Eleanor said, accepting the cup he offered. "I know you must want your privacy. Everyone says you've been keeping to yourself since your father passed." "It's all right," Thomas said, though he wasn't sure it was. "How can I help you?" Eleanor looked down at her tea for a long moment before speaking. "I wanted to ask you about William, about his last days. The letter from his commanding officer said very little, just that he had died bravely, doing his duty. But I wondered if you could tell me more, if there was anything else." This was what Thomas had dreaded. The questions he had known would come eventually. What could he tell her? That her brother had died in screaming agony, that the smell of his blood had mixed with the chemical reek of high explosive and the eternal stench of the trenches, that in the end there had been nothing brave or meaningful about it, just the random violence of modern war reducing a human being to scattered meat. "He was a good soldier," Thomas said carefully, "and a good friend. He kept everyone's spirits up, even in the worst times. He used to talk about home, about the furniture he planned to make when he got back. He had real talent, everyone said so." Eleanor nodded, blinking rapidly. "He wrote about you in his letters. He said you looked after the younger men, that you always volunteered for the dangerous jobs, so others wouldn't have to do them. He admired you." Thomas felt something twist inside him. He had tried to protect them. The boys from the village who had enlisted together in that first rush of patriotic fervor. He had tried so hard, but the war had taken them anyway, one by one. Billy Hartley and Jack Morrison, and young Peter Collins, who had lied about his age to enlist, who had been 16 years old when a sniper's bullet found him during a dawn raid. Thomas had led that raid. He had given the orders that put Peter Collins in that particular trench at that particular moment. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "I'm so sorry I tried to bring them home. I really tried." Eleanor reached across the table and touched his hand, a brief gesture of comfort that startled him. "No one blames you, Mr. Ashford. How could they? You came back. You survived. That's what matters now." But Thomas knew it wasn't what mattered. Survival felt less like a gift and more like a sentence, a burden he would carry for whatever years remained to him. The dead were finished with their suffering. It was the living who had to go on, who had to figure out how to exist in a world that no longer made sense, where all the old certainties had been ground to mud in Flanders fields. Eleanor stayed for an hour, and Thomas found himself talking more than he had in months. Not about the war, he couldn't speak of that, not truly, but about small things, safe things. She told him about the village, about how her father's carpentry business was struggling now without William to help with the work, about the new vicar, who was trying to organize some sort of memorial for the men who hadn't come home. She mentioned, almost casually, that many families were having trouble making ends meet, that the promises of a land fit for heroes seemed to have been forgotten by those in London who had sent their sons to die. When she finally rose to leave, Thomas walked her to the door. The autumn sun was higher now, burning off the last of the mist, revealing the fields in all their neglected glory. Weeds grew thick where wheat should have been planted. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. Everything spoke of abandonment, of a farm dying by inches. "You should consider what you're going to do," Eleanor said gently, following his gaze. "The land won't wait forever. If you mean to farm it, you'll need to start preparing for spring planting soon. If you don't..." She let the sentence trail off. "I know," Thomas said. I don't know how to begin. It feels like I've forgotten everything I knew before." "Perhaps you have," Eleanor said. "Perhaps we all have. But we have to learn again, don't we? We have to figure out how to live in this new world, even if we didn't choose it." After she left, Thomas stood in the doorway for a long time, thinking about her word, the new world. That's what the newspapers called it, the peace that had been won at such terrible cost. But it didn't feel new to Thomas. It felt old and tired and broken, a world of widows and orphans and men who woke screaming in the night. The afternoon found him walking the boundaries of his land, something he hadn't done since before his father's death. The hedgerows were overgrown, the drainage ditches clogged with debris. The south field, which had always been good for barley, lay fallow and choked with thistle. His father would have been appalled. John Ashford had been a meticulous farmer, a man who believed that land was a sacred trust, that those who worked it had a duty to pass it on to the next generation in better condition than they had received it. But what if there was no next generation? Thomas was 32 years old, unmarried, with no prospects of changing that state. Most of the young women he had known before the war had married others, or moved away, or joined the ranks of those who would never marry because their sweethearts lay in foreign graves. Even if he had wanted to court someone, what could he offer? A broken-down farm and a broken-down man who couldn't sleep through the night without reliving the war. As he walked, he found himself thinking about the men he had served with, the ones who hadn't made it home. They would never have this problem, this question of what to do with the rest of their lives. Their stories had ended in the mud of France and Belgium, final and complete. Sometimes Thomas envied them that finality. At least they were finished with the struggle, the daily battle to find meaning in a world that had revealed itself to be meaningless, where young men died for nothing more significant than a few yards of contested ground. But then he thought of Eleanor Hartley's face, the way she had touched his hand, and he felt ashamed of his self-pity. She had lost a brother. Mrs. Patterson had lost 2 sons. The Morrisons had lost their only child. They were all carrying their grief, all trying to go on despite everything. What right did he have to give up when others were finding the strength to continue? The sun was setting by the time he returned to the farmhouse, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him uncomfortably of burning villages seen from a distance. He lit a lamp in the kitchen and sat down at the table with paper and pencil, forcing himself to make a list of what needed to be done if he was going to try to bring the farm back to life. It was a daunting inventory: repairs to buildings, clearing of fields, procurement of seed and equipment, hiring of labor if he could find any men who hadn't been killed or crippled by the war. The work would take years. It would require all his money and more than he possessed of hope and energy. And even if he succeeded, even if he managed to restore the farm to productivity, what then? Would the land heal him? Would the rhythm of seasons and the satisfaction of honest work fill the emptiness inside him, replace what the war had taken? He didn't know. But as he sat there in the lamplight, making his lists and trying to imagine a future that extended beyond the next day, he felt something stir inside him, some faint ember of the person he had been before the war. It wasn't much, it might not be enough, but it was something, and perhaps that was how you began, with something small and fragile, a tiny point of light in the darkness, and the determination to keep it burning no matter what. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost thick on the ground, and ice crystallizing in the water trough. Thomas woke early, pulled from sleep not by nightmares for once, but by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. He dressed quickly and went out to survey the barn, making notes on what timber and tools he would need to begin repairs. The work was beyond his skill alone. He would need help, someone who knew carpentry and building. The thought came to him suddenly. Eleanor had mentioned her father's carpentry business struggling without William to help. Perhaps they could help each other. He could offer work, steady employment through the winter, and in return, Robert Hartley could teach him the skills he would need to maintain the farm buildings. It might not be much, but it would be a beginning. He walked into Aldermere that afternoon, his bad leg protesting the distance, but his mind clearer than it had been in weeks. The village looked much as it always had. The same stone cottages with their thatched roofs, the same narrow lanes winding between ancient walls, the same church tower rising above the rooftops. But there were differences if you knew where to look. The War Memorial Committee was erecting a stone cross in the churchyard, a list of names already carved into its face. Too many names for such a small village. Nearly 30 men gone, from a population of barely 300 souls. Hartley's carpentry shop occupied a converted barn at the edge of the village. Thomas found Robert Hartley working alone, planing a length of oak with the slow, methodical movements of a craftsman who had done the same task 10,000 times. He was a man in his 50s, gray-haired and stoop-shouldered, with the knotted hands of someone who had spent his life working with wood. He looked up when Thomas entered, his expression wary. "Mr. Ashford," he said, setting down his plane. "Eleanor said she visited you yesterday." "She did," Thomas confirmed. "I hope she didn't trouble you with worry. I know the war is not an easy subject." Robert shook his head slowly. "She needed to talk to someone who knew William at the end. I'm grateful you were kind to her. She's had a hard time of it, losing her brother." They were close, those two. Thomas nodded, feeling the familiar weight of guilt settle over him. "Mr. Hartley, I came to talk to you about some work. My farm needs extensive repairs, and I'm not skilled enough to do it alone. I was hoping you might be willing to take on the job. I can pay fairly, and it would be steady work through the winter." Robert studied him for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "You're planning to stay, then? To work the land?" "I'm planning to try," Thomas said. "I don't know if I'll succeed, but I think I need to try." Something shifted in Robert's expression, a softening around the eyes. "William talked about you in his letters. He said you were the kind of officer who deserved to come home, who had something worth coming home to. He'd be glad, I think, to know you were rebuilding rather than giving up." The words hit Thomas harder than he expected. He had to look away, blinking against the sudden sting in his eyes. "I'm not sure I deserve that faith, but I appreciate it." "And we all deserve a second chance," Robert said quietly. "The war took enough from us. It doesn't get to take the future, too. When do you want me to start?" They spent the next hour walking through the farm buildings, assessing damage and planning repairs. Thomas found himself grateful for Robert's quiet competence, the way the older man could look at a sagging roof beam or a cracked foundation and immediately understand what needed to be done. They discussed timber and nails, costs and timelines, the practical details that gave shape to hope. As they worked, other people began to appear. Word had spread quickly through the village. It always did, that Thomas Ashford was planning to restore his father's farm. Mrs. Patterson came by with a basket of bread and cheese, saying she'd heard he wasn't eating properly. Jack Morrison's widow arrived with her 2 young sons, asking if there might be work for them when spring came. Even the new vicar stopped by, a young man named Father Michael, who had served as a chaplain in France, and who understood without Thomas having to explain why some days the sound of a door slamming could send him diving for cover. By the time dusk fell, Thomas felt overwhelmed by the unexpected support, the way the village was gathering around him like a family around one of its wounded members. He hadn't realized how isolated he had become, how thoroughly he had withdrawn into his grief and guilt. The war had taught him to trust no one, to expect nothing but suffering and loss. But here were these people, these neighbors, who had suffered their own losses, reaching out to help him rebuild. That night he sat at the kitchen table and continued working on his plans. But now they were more detailed, more concrete, informed by Robert's expertise and by the offers of help that had come from unexpected quarters. He sketched out a timeline: repairs through the winter, land preparation in early spring, planting when the weather turned warm. It would be hard work, possibly too hard for one man with a bad leg and worse memories. But he wouldn't be one man alone. He would have help. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Thomas had not known since before the war. Robert Hartley arrived each morning just after dawn, and they worked together on the most urgent repairs. The barn roof that was letting in rain, the fence lines that needed mending, the drainage ditches that required clearing before winter rains turned the fields into swamps. The work was hard, physical labor that left Thomas exhausted by nightfall. But it was a clean exhaustion, the kind that came from honest work rather than the soul-deep weariness of war. Eleanor came by twice a week, bringing lunch for the workers and staying to help where she could. Thomas learned that she had trained as a teacher before the war, but the school in Aldermere had closed when too many children were pulled out to help with farm work or family businesses struggling without their men. She spoke little of her own difficulties, but Thomas could see the strain in her face, the way she carefully mended her clothing, the threadbare quality of her coat. The war had impoverished the Hartleys as it had impoverished so many families, taking not just their son but their economic future. One afternoon in early November, as they sat eating the simple meal Eleanor had prepared, Robert mentioned that he was worried about keeping his shop open through the winter. "There's not enough work in the village anymore," he said, staring into his tea. "People can't afford new furniture. They're making do with what they have, mending rather than replacing. I may have to close the shop, look for work in the city." The thought of the Hartleys leaving struck Thomas with unexpected force. In the weeks since they had started working together, he had come to depend on Robert's steady presence, Eleanor's quiet efficiency. They had become something like friends, or at least companions in the shared struggle to build something from the ruins the war had left behind. "Don't close the shop," Thomas heard himself say. "I have an idea." The idea had been forming in his mind for days, crystallizing as he worked alongside Robert and saw the quality of the man's craftsmanship. The farm would need furniture eventually. The house was full of pieces that were falling apart, that had been old when Thomas's grandparents were young. But more than that, Thomas had been thinking about what the village needed. What might help it recover from the wounds the war had inflicted? "What if we started a cooperative?" he said, the words coming faster as the plan took shape. "There are 6 farms around Aldermere, all of them struggling like mine. Most are being worked by women whose husbands didn't come home, or by men who came back broken like me. What if we pooled our resources, shared equipment, helped with each other's harvests, bought seed and supplies together to get better prices? And your shop could provide the carpentry work we all need, with payment coming from the cooperative fund." Robert frowned, considering. "It's an unusual arrangement. I'm not sure people would go for it." "They might," Eleanor said quietly, "if Thomas asked them. If a returning soldier said this was how we could rebuild, I think people would listen." Thomas felt uncomfortable with the idea of trading on his service, but he couldn't deny that Eleanor might be right. The men who had come home from the war carried a certain moral authority, a sense that they had earned the right to speak about what the nation owed its citizens. If he could use that authority to help the village recover, perhaps it would give some meaning to his survival, some purpose to the years that stretched ahead of him. The meeting was held in the village hall 3 weeks later, on a cold evening in late November, when the first snow of winter was beginning to fall. Thomas had expected a poor turnout. Why would people trust a plan proposed by a recluse who had barely spoken to his neighbors in months? But the hall was nearly full, farmers and shopkeepers and laborers crowding onto the benches, their faces weathered and worn but alert with interest. Thomas stood at the front of the room, his notes clutched in hands that trembled slightly despite his efforts to control them. Public speaking had never been his strength, and the sea of faces watching him brought back unwelcome memories of addressing his men before an attack, knowing that some of them would be dead before the day ended. But these weren't soldiers. These were his neighbors, people who had known him since childhood, who had suffered their own losses and were looking for any path forward that didn't lead to complete destitution. He took a deep breath and began to speak. He explained his idea for a cooperative, for pooling resources and sharing labor. He talked about how the war had shown him the power of men working together toward a common goal, how the trenches had taught him that survival often depended on helping your neighbor as much as helping yourself. He admitted his own struggles, his fear that he might fail at farming, his need for help, and his willingness to offer help in return. When he finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then Alice Morrison stood up, a thin woman in widow's black, her face gaunt with grief and hardship. "My Jack would have liked this idea," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. "He always said the war taught him that we were stronger together than apart. If Mr. Ashford is willing to lead this, I'll support it." Others spoke then, voicing support or concerns, asking practical questions about how the cooperative would function, how decisions would be made, how profits would be shared. The discussion continued for 2 hours, sometimes heated but never hostile. A community wrestling with how to survive in a world that had been turned upside down by 4 years of mechanized slaughter. In the end, they voted to try it. 12 farms would join the cooperative, along with several village businesses that could provide services the farms needed. Robert Hartley would serve as the cooperative's primary carpenter. Thomas, despite his protests that he was hardly qualified to lead anything, was elected as the cooperative's organizer, responsible for coordinating shared projects and managing the common fund. Walking home that night through the falling snow, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt since before the war. A sense of connection to something larger than himself, a feeling that his actions mattered, that what he did tomorrow might help build something worth building. It wasn't happiness exactly. He wasn't sure he would ever feel that simple emotion again, but it was purpose, and that was enough. The winter that followed was the hardest Thomas had ever known, and he had known some hard winters in the trenches. The cooperative's first season tested every assumption, challenged every plan. Equipment broke down, livestock died, the weather was brutal, with January bringing storms that buried the village under 3 feet of snow and left them cut off from the outside world for 10 days. There were moments when Thomas lay awake in the dark, listening to the wind howl around the farmhouse, convinced that the whole enterprise would collapse, that he had led his neighbors into a disaster as surely as he had led his men into the German machine guns at Passchendaele. But they persevered. When the Wilsons lost half their sheep to disease, the cooperative pooled money to help them restock. When Thomas's bad leg seized up in the cold and left him barely able to walk for a week, Robert and Eleanor took over managing the repair work without complaint. When supplies ran low in February, and there was real concern about having enough food to last until spring, families shared what they had, no one hoarding while others went hungry. It was, Thomas realized, a different kind of battle than the one he had fought in France. There were no dramatic charges, no moments of glory or heroism, just the daily grind of survival, the patient work of keeping people fed and warm and hopeful despite everything. In some ways, it was harder than the war had been. At least in the trenches, you knew who the enemy was. Here, the enemy was despair, the slow, grinding hopelessness that made people give up and stop trying. Eleanor became his unexpected ally in fighting that enemy. She had a gift for seeing what people needed before they asked, for knowing when a kind word or a shared meal might make the difference between someone continuing to struggle and simply surrendering to circumstance. She organized social gatherings at the village hall, simple events where people could come together and remember how to laugh, how to enjoy each other's company without the shadow of loss hanging over everything. Thomas found himself drawn to these gatherings, despite his instinct to avoid crowds, to hide away in the farmhouse with his ghosts and his guilt. Eleanor had a way of making him feel useful without making him feel exposed, of giving him tasks that played to his strengths, helping to organize the children's games, fixing broken equipment, talking with the other veterans who sometimes needed to speak with someone who understood. It was at one of these gatherings in late March, as the first hints of spring began to show in the warming air and lengthening days, that Thomas realized he had begun to heal. Not completely. He suspected those wounds would never fully close, but enough that he could sometimes go hours without thinking about the war, could occasionally fall asleep without dreading the nightmares that would come, could look at the fields around him and see potential, rather than just a reminder of everything that had been lost. He was standing outside the village hall, watching the children play in the last of the winter snow, when Eleanor came to stand beside him. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there in companionable silence, her shoulder nearly touching his. Thomas was aware of her warmth, her presence, in a way he hadn't been aware of anyone in years. "You've done something remarkable," she said finally. "The cooperative is working. People have hope again." Thomas shook his head. "It's not me. It's all of us working together. It started with you," Eleanor insisted. "You gave people permission to try again, to believe that the future didn't have to be just a long slide into poverty and despair. That matters. "Your brother should have come home," Thomas said, the words bursting out before he could stop them. "He should be here, building his furniture, courting some village girl, planning a family. He had so much life ahead of him, so much to offer. Why did I survive when better men died?" Eleanor turned to face him, her expression serious. "You survived because you were lucky, Thomas. That's all. Not because you deserved it more than William. Not because God chose you over him. Just luck, random and meaningless. But what you do with that luck, with the life you were given, that's where meaning comes in. You can waste it in guilt and grief, or you can use it to help others, to build something that honors the memory of those who died." "Is that what I'm doing?" Thomas asked. "Honoring them? I think so," Eleanor said. "I think William would say so if he could. He always believed in working together, in building rather than tearing down. That's what you're doing now. That's what we're all doing." She reached out and took his hand, a simple gesture that felt momentous in its intimacy. Thomas looked down at their joined hands, hers small and work-roughened, his scarred and calloused, and felt something shift inside him, some final barrier between the man he had been and the man he might become beginning to crumble. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it came with a rush of warmth and growth that seemed to carry a promise of renewal. The cooperative members gathered for a massive planting effort, moving from farm to farm in a coordinated dance of labor and mutual support. Thomas watched his fields being planted with wheat and barley, watched his neighbors working side by side, and felt a swell of emotion he couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps, or gratitude, or simply the profound relief of realizing that he was no longer alone, that he had somehow stumbled into belonging to something again. Robert Hartley worked alongside his daughter and Thomas, the three of them becoming a familiar team that others began to comment on with knowing smiles and gentle teasing. Thomas tried not to think too much about what that might mean, about the way his heart lifted when Eleanor arrived each morning, about how natural it felt to work beside her, to share the rhythm of the day's tasks. But as the weeks passed and the crops began to grow, he couldn't ignore the truth that was becoming increasingly obvious. He was falling in love with Eleanor Hartley. It felt like a betrayal somehow, as if he had no right to happiness, when so many of his men lay cold in foreign graves. What gave him the privilege of love and life when they had been denied both? Yet he couldn't seem to stop it, this gradual opening of his heart to possibility. Eleanor was patient with his silences, gentle with his occasional retreats into darkness when the memories became too much. She never demanded more than he could give, never pushed him to speak of things he couldn't articulate. She simply existed beside him, steady and real, a reminder that there was more to life than pain and loss. It was late May when Thomas finally found the courage to speak of his feelings. They were walking through the wheat fields at sunset, checking the growth of the young plants. The fields were green now, a fresh, living green that spoke of health and growth and all the promise of summer to come. The war felt very far away in that moment, as if it belonged to another lifetime, another world. "Eleanor," Thomas said, his voice rough with nervousness, "I need to tell you something." She turned to look at him, her face open and curious. "What is it?" "I care for you," he said simply. "More than I should, perhaps. More than I have any right to. I know I'm damaged, that I'm not the man I was before the war. I know I wake screaming in the night sometimes, that there are days when I can barely speak for the weight of memory. I know I'm poor company, and that I have nothing much to offer except a run-down farm and a broken heart that may never fully heal. But I care for you, and I needed you to know that." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas felt his stomach twist with anxiety. He had made a terrible mistake, had presumed too much, had ruined the easy friendship they had built over the long winter. But then she smiled, a slow, warm smile that lit up her entire face. "Thomas Ashford," she said, "you are the most foolish man I've ever known if you think I haven't been waiting for you to say exactly that for the past 3 months. She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough to smell the lavender she wore. You're not damaged beyond repair. You're healing, slowly perhaps, but healing nonetheless. And I don't need you to be the man you were before the war. I need you to be the man you're becoming. Someone who knows darkness but chooses light, who understands loss but works for life, who carries grief but still finds room for hope. Thomas reached out tentatively, cupping her face in his hands, feeling the solid reality of her beneath his palms. I don't know if I can be that man. You already are that man, Eleanor said. You just don't see it yet. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home, like finding something he hadn't even known he'd lost. And for the first time since the war ended, Thomas Ashford allowed himself to believe that perhaps the future might hold something other than mere survival, that perhaps there was room in his damaged heart for joy. The summer that followed was one Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. The cooperative flourished as the crops grew tall and strong. The shared work and shared resources proved to be exactly what the struggling farms needed, and word began to spread to other villages about what Aldermere had accomplished. Thomas found himself traveling to neighboring communities, helping others establish similar cooperatives, sharing the lessons they had learned. But more than the success of the cooperative, Thomas remembered that summer for the quiet joy of falling in love. He and Eleanor spent their evenings walking through the fields, talking about everything and nothing, building a foundation of shared understanding that felt solid and real. She told him about her childhood, about William and the games they had played, about her dreams of teaching again someday. He found himself able to speak of the war in ways he never had before. Not the horrific details that still haunted his nightmares, but the smaller truths, the friendships he had made, the moments of unexpected beauty even in the midst of horror, the way suffering had taught him what truly mattered. Robert Hartley watched their courtship with obvious approval, and gradually Thomas began to feel accepted into the family that had lost so much to the war. He understood that he could never replace William, that his presence might even be painful in some ways, a reminder of the son who should have been there instead. But the Hartleys welcomed him regardless, making room in their grief for new happiness, demonstrating a generosity of spirit that left Thomas humbled and grateful. The wheat grew golden under the summer sun, and Thomas walked through his fields each evening, checking the progress of the grain, pulling the occasional weed, feeling the satisfaction of watching something grow under his care. The physical work continued to exhaust him, but it was a good exhaustion now, one that brought sleep instead of nightmares, that left him too tired to dwell on the past. His legs still ached, especially when rain was coming, and there were still nights when he woke gasping, Billy Hartley's face swimming before him in the darkness. But those nights were becoming less frequent, the grip of the past loosening just enough that he could breathe. In July, the cooperative organized a summer festival, the first real celebration the village had held since before the war. There was music and dancing, games for the children, tables laden with food that people had contributed from their gardens and larders. Thomas stood at the edge of the crowd watching the festivities with a mixture of pleasure and discomfort. Large gatherings still made him nervous, the press of bodies and the noise sometimes triggering memories of chaos and confusion on the battlefield. But Eleanor found him there, as she always seemed to know when he needed her presence. She slipped her hand into his and simply stood with him, not pushing him to join the dancing or the games, just being there. They watched the children running and laughing, the older folks sitting in the shade and telling stories, the young couples swaying to the music from the makeshift band that had assembled in the corner of the village green. "This is what we're fighting for now," Eleanor said softly. "Not territory or glory or any of those grand abstractions. Just this, the chance to gather together in peace, to celebrate life instead of mourning death, to let children be children instead of orphans waiting for news from the front." Thomas squeezed her hand, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. She was right, of course. This simple gathering, with its modest pleasures and its gentle joy, represented everything the war had threatened to destroy. The fact that it was happening at all, that people could come together and smile and share food and music, felt like a small miracle, a tiny victory against the darkness that had almost consumed them all. As the sun set and lanterns were lit around the green, Thomas found himself drawn into the dancing despite his usual reluctance. Eleanor pulled him into the circle, and though his bad leg made him clumsy and uncertain, she guided him through the steps with patient grace. Around them, other couples swayed and turned, their faces warm in the lamplight, and Thomas felt a sudden overwhelming gratitude for this moment, for being alive to experience it, for having someone to share it with. Later, as they walked home through the warm summer darkness, Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the future, about what comes next for us." Thomas felt his heart begin to race. He had been thinking about the future too, had been working up the courage to ask the question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. But now that the moment was here, he found himself almost paralyzed with fear. What if she said no? What if she realized that he was too damaged, too broken, too haunted by the past to be a proper husband? "I've been thinking too," he managed. "Eleanor, I know I'm not much of a catch. I know there are probably a dozen men in the county who could offer you more than I can. But I love you. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone after what I saw in France. And I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you, trying to build something good and lasting and real. Will you marry me?" Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "Oh, Thomas," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Of course I'll marry you. I can't imagine my life without you in it now. You've become part of everything that matters to me. The cooperative, the village, the future we're all trying to build together. But more than that, you've become part of my heart. I love you, damaged parts and all. Those scars you carry don't make you less. They make you who you are, and who you are is exactly who I want." They stood there in the darkness, holding each other, and Thomas felt something inside him finally fully break open. Not in pain this time, but in relief and joy, in the overwhelming recognition that he had found his way back to life, that the long, dark tunnel of the past year was finally opening onto light. In August, as the wheat ripened toward harvest, Thomas asked Eleanor to marry him. They were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse in the warm evening air, watching the sun set over the fields. He had no ring, no elaborate plan, just a simple question spoken from the heart. The engagement was announced at the next cooperative meeting, and the response was immediate and enthusiastic. People who had watched Thomas struggle through the long, dark months after his return home now saw him transformed, saw the way Eleanor's love had helped heal wounds that no doctor could have treated. The wedding was set for October, after the harvest was complete, after the year's work was finished. The harvest that year exceeded everyone's expectations. The cooperative farms brought in their crops working together, moving from field to field in a coordinated effort that cut the usual harvest time in half. Thomas watched the golden wheat being cut and bundled and carted away to storage, and felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond mere economic success. This grain represented survival, represented the community's refusal to give up despite everything the war had taken from them. But the harvest also brought its share of difficulties. The weather turned unpredictable in late August, with sudden storms that threatened the crops still standing in the fields. The cooperative members worked frantically to bring in the grain before the rain could ruin it, laboring from dawn until long after dark, racing against the clouds gathering on the horizon. Thomas pushed himself harder than he should have, his bad leg screaming in protest as he hauled bundles of wheat from the fields to the wagons. He knew he was overdoing it, knew he would pay for this exertion with days of pain and immobility, but he couldn't stop himself. This harvest meant too much, represented too much hope and effort and collective determination. It was during one of these long harvest days that the accident happened. Thomas was working in the south field when he heard someone shout. He turned to see one of the younger boys, Samuel Wilson, trapped beneath an overturned wagon. The wagon had hit a rut and tipped, spilling its load of wheat and pinning the boy beneath its weight. For a moment Thomas froze, paralyzed by a sudden vivid flashback to France, to men trapped beneath collapsed trenches, screaming for help that came too late or not at all. His vision tunneled, his breathing came in short gasps, and he felt himself beginning to panic, to slip back into that place of helpless horror where the war still lived inside him. But then he heard Eleanor's voice, sharp and clear, cutting through the fog of memory. "Thomas, we need you. Help us lift this." The sound of her voice, the urgency and trust in it, snapped him back to the present. He stumbled forward, joined the other men gathering around the wagon, and together they lifted it just enough for someone to pull Samuel free. The boy was bruised and shaken but not seriously injured, and as they helped him to his feet, Thomas felt his hands trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and remembered terror. Eleanor found him later, sitting alone behind the barn, trying to get his breathing under control. She sat down beside him without speaking, just pressed her shoulder against his, sharing her warmth and her solid presence. Gradually, the panic subsided. The memories retreated back into whatever dark corner of his mind they inhabited, and Thomas was able to breathe normally again. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I thought I was past all that. I thought I'd gotten better." "You have gotten better," Eleanor said firmly. "But healing isn't linear, Thomas. There will be setbacks, moments when the past comes rushing back. That doesn't mean you're failing. It just means you're human, and that what you went through was terrible enough to leave lasting marks. The important thing is that you came back from it. You didn't let it paralyze you. You heard me calling and you came, and you helped. That's what matters." Thomas nodded, not entirely convinced but wanting to believe her. He had hoped that love would cure him, that building a new life would erase the old traumas. But he was beginning to understand that it didn't work that way, that the war would always be part of him, that healing meant learning to live with the scars rather than expecting them to disappear. The harvest was completed 2 days before the autumn rains began in earnest. The cooperative had brought in enough grain to see them through the winter and sell a surplus besides. There was a sense of triumph in the village, a feeling that they had accomplished something significant, that they had proven the cooperative model could work even in difficult conditions. The wedding preparations began immediately. Eleanor and her mother worked on her dress, altering a gown that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother, adding lace and embroidery with careful, loving hands. Thomas worked with Robert to make repairs to the farmhouse, to prepare it for Eleanor's arrival as his wife. They fixed the sagging porch, replaced cracked windows, repaired the chimney that had been smoking badly for years. As Thomas worked on the house, making it ready for Eleanor, he found himself thinking about the future in ways he never had before. He imagined children running through these rooms, imagined teaching a son or daughter to work the land, imagined growing old with Eleanor in this place his family had held for generations. These thoughts no longer filled him with dread or despair. Instead, they brought a quiet contentment, a sense that life might actually be worth living, that the years ahead might hold more joy than sorrow. The wedding took place on a brilliant October day, the sky a deep crystalline blue, the air crisp with the promise of winter, but still touched by the warmth of autumn sun. The whole village attended, crowding into the Norman church where Thomas' ancestors had been married and baptized and buried for 200 years. Father Michael performed the ceremony, his words simple and heartfelt, speaking of new beginnings and the courage it took to choose life after surviving so much death. Eleanor wore the altered dress, and she looked beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or style. She looked beautiful in her strength and her certainty, in the clear-eyed love she offered without reservation or condition. When Thomas spoke his vows, his voice was steady for the first time in years. No tremor of doubt or fear, just honest promise. To love her, to cherish her, to build a life together that honored those who couldn't be there to see it. The reception was held in the village hall, the same room where Thomas had first proposed the cooperative nearly a year before. There was music and dancing, simple food made special by the fact that everyone had contributed something, that the feast represented the community's abundance and generosity. Thomas danced with his bride, his bad leg protesting but not enough to stop him, and felt almost dizzy with happiness. But even in the midst of celebration, There were moments of sadness, reminders of those who should have been there but weren't. When Robert Hartley gave a toast to the happy couple, his voice broke as he mentioned William the son who should have been standing beside them, who should have been building furniture for their home, who should have been an uncle to the children they might have. The room fell silent for a moment, everyone thinking of their own losses, of the empty chairs at the feast, of the men who would never come home. Father Michael raised his glass and spoke into that silence. "To the fallen," he said quietly, "may we honor their memory by living well, by building the peace they died to give us, by refusing to let their sacrifice be meaningless. They gave us the future. Let us make it worth their gift." Everyone drank to that toast, and Thomas felt tears on his cheeks, though whether they were tears of grief or gratitude, or some complicated mixture of both, he couldn't have said. He looked around the room at his neighbors, his friends, these people who had suffered and survived, and were now choosing to celebrate despite everything. This was what the war had been about, he realized. Not the treaties or the territorial adjustments or the political maneuvering that would occupy diplomats for years to come. Just this, the right of ordinary people to gather in peace, to marry and raise families and work the land without fear of shells falling from the sky. Later, when the dancing had wound down and people were beginning to drift home, Robert Hartley pulled Thomas aside. The older man's eyes were bright with tears, but he was smiling. "Thank you," Robert said quietly, "for making her happy, for giving her a reason to look forward rather than back, and for," he paused, struggling with the words, "for coming home when William couldn't, for not wasting the life you were given." Thomas embraced him, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. This was absolution he had never expected, forgiveness for surviving. When better men had died, he knew it didn't erase his guilt, didn't change the fundamental injustice of his survival, but it helped. This acknowledgement that his life had value, that his continued existence honored rather than diminished the memory of those who had fallen. Thomas and Eleanor left the reception as the autumn moon rose over the village, walking together through the quiet streets to the farmhouse that was now their home. The house was dark and empty, but it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a beginning, like a place where new life could take root and grow. That first night as husband and wife, they lay together in the darkness, talking quietly about their hopes and dreams, about the life they wanted to build together. Eleanor spoke of reopening the school, of teaching the children who were growing up in the shadow of the war. Thomas talked about expanding the cooperative, about helping more struggling farms find their way forward, but mostly they talked about the ordinary things that make up a life, what to plant in the spring, what repairs the house still needed, whether they should get a dog, where they might go for a holiday someday when the farm was more established. These small, mundane plans felt precious to Thomas in a way that grand ambitions never could. After years of living with death and destruction, the prospect of an ordinary life seemed like the greatest gift imaginable. The autumn deepened, the days growing shorter and colder as winter approached. Thomas and Eleanor settled into married life, learning each other's rhythms and habits, negotiating the small adjustments that living together required. Eleanor brought her books and her plants to the farmhouse, her practical efficiency and her gentle humor. The house that had felt like a tomb for so long began to feel like a home again, filled with conversation and laughter, and the ordinary sounds of two people building a life together. The cooperative continued to grow and evolve. More farms joined, expanding the network of mutual support and shared resources. Thomas found himself spending more time organizing and coordinating, less time doing physical labor. His leg was grateful for this shift, though he sometimes missed the satisfaction of working the land directly. In November, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The news filled Thomas with a complex mixture of emotions, joy and terror in equal measure. The thought of bringing a child into this broken world seemed almost impossibly brave, but Eleanor was radiant with happiness, already planning the nursery, already dreaming of the future. "We're building something new," she said, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "Not just for ourselves, but for the next generation." This child will grow up in a world where communities help each other, where cooperation matters more than competition. That's worth something, Thomas. That's worth everything. Thomas tried to share her certainty, but parenthood terrified him in ways that war never had. What if he was a terrible father? What if the nightmares never stopped? What if he could not protect this child the way he'd failed to protect his men in France? The weight of responsibility felt crushing some days, almost too much to bear. But Eleanor was patient with his fears, as she was patient with everything about him. She reminded him that they would learn together, that neither of them had to be perfect, that love and effort counted for more than certainty. And gradually, as her pregnancy progressed and winter settled over the countryside, Thomas found himself beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could do this. Maybe they could raise a child who would never know the horror of war, who would grow up in a world slowly healing from its wounds. The winter was hard, as winters always were. But this year, Thomas had Eleanor beside him, had the warmth of shared purpose and shared life to keep the darkness at bay. When the nightmares came, she was there to wake him gently, to hold him until the shaking stopped, to remind him that he was safe, that the war was over, that he was home. They spent the long evenings by the fire, reading to each other, making plans for the spring planting, preparing for the baby that would arrive in summer. Eleanor knitted tiny clothes while Thomas repaired furniture and tools, both of them working toward a future that was becoming more real with each passing day. In February, word came that the Treaty of Versailles had been signed, officially ending the state of war that had persisted even after the Armistice. The news felt anticlimactic to Thomas. The war had ended for him not when the guns fell silent or when diplomats signed papers, but gradually over the course of months, through the patient work of rebuilding through love and community and the daily choice to keep living despite everything. Still, the village held a small ceremony at the war memorial, which had finally been completed. Thomas stood with the other veterans, looking at the names carved into the stone: Billy Hartley, Jack Morrison, Peter Collins, and so many others. 28 names in all, from a village of 300 souls. Nearly 1 in 10 of the village's population, gone forever. Father Michael led them in prayer, and then asked the veterans to speak if they wished. Most remained silent, their grief and trauma too deep for public words, but Thomas found himself stepping forward, driven by some impulse he couldn't name. These men, he said, his voice rough with emotion, gave everything. But their sacrifice shouldn't bind us to the past. It should inspire us to build a future worthy of what they lost. Every day we spend helping each other, every act of kindness and cooperation, every child we raise in peace, that's how we honor them. Not by glorifying war or pretending their deaths were glorious, but by making sure the world they died for becomes the world they deserve to live in. There was silence when he finished, and then quiet murmurs of agreement. Alice Morrison reached out and squeezed his hand. Other veterans nodded, their faces showing a mixture of pain and recognition. They all carried the same burden, the same question. How do you honor the dead while still finding a way to live? Spring came early that year, bursting forth with sudden warmth and an explosion of wildflowers across the fields. The cooperative began its second year of planting, and this time the work went more smoothly, informed by the previous year's experience. New members had joined over the winter, and the network of farms now extended to 3 neighboring villages. The model they had pioneered in Aldermere was spreading, offering hope to struggling communities across the county. Thomas watched Eleanor working in the garden behind the farmhouse, her pregnancy now visible in the swell of her belly, and felt a contentment he had never imagined possible. She was planting vegetables for the summer, carrots and peas and beans, practical things that would feed them through the year ahead. But she was also planting flowers, bright splashes of color that served no purpose except beauty, except joy. That image, Eleanor planting flowers while pregnant with their child, became a kind of talisman for Thomas, something he returned to in his mind when the darkness threatened. It represented everything the war had tried to destroy: life continuing, beauty persisting, hope refusing to die despite overwhelming evidence that it should. The baby was born on a warm June evening, as the longest day of the year faded into dusk. Eleanor labored for 12 hours with the village midwife and her mother in attendance. Thomas paced the kitchen below, listening to the sounds from upstairs, terrified in a way he hadn't been even under fire. At least in battle, he'd had some control, some ability to act. Here he was powerless, able only to wait and hope and pray. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, Thomas felt his knees go weak with relief. The midwife came down and told him he had a daughter, that both mother and child were healthy and well. He climbed the stairs on shaking legs to find Eleanor exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny red-faced infant wrapped in a white blanket. "Your daughter," Eleanor said, smiling up at him. "What should we call her?" They had discussed names for months without reaching a decision. But now, looking at this tiny new person who had entered his life, Thomas knew with sudden certainty what her name should be. "Hope," he said quietly. "Let's call her Hope." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, understanding immediately what he meant. After all the loss and grief and darkness, after everything the war had taken, here was something new and precious and pure. Here was the future they had been building toward, the reason for all their effort and struggle. Here was hope made flesh, a tiny declaration that life was stronger than death, that love could persist even in the ruins of war. Thomas reached out and touched his daughter's impossibly small hand, felt her tiny fingers curl around his scarred and calloused finger. In that moment, something inside him finally, fully healed. Not the wounds themselves. Those would always be there, always ache in cold weather or in the dark hours before dawn. But his relationship to those wounds changed. They were no longer the sum total of who he was. They were just part of his story, one chapter in a larger narrative that was still being written. The summer that followed was the happiest Thomas had ever known. He divided his time between the farm, the cooperative, and his new family, finding a rhythm that felt sustainable and good. Hope was a quiet baby, content to lie in her basket and watch the world with solemn dark eyes. Eleanor recovered quickly from the birth and was soon back to her usual efficient self, managing the household and helping with the cooperative's administrative work. The cooperative had its best harvest yet that second year. The combination of shared resources, coordinated effort, and improving techniques meant that farms were producing more than they had in years. There was enough surplus to begin investing in improvements, better equipment, proper storage facilities, even the beginning of a lending library that Eleanor helped organize. In August, a delegation from London came to visit, government officials interested in the cooperative model as a way to address the rural poverty that was plaguing the countryside. Thomas found himself giving tours and explaining their methods, feeling uncomfortable with the attention but recognizing that this might help other communities establish similar systems. The officials were impressed, but skeptical. "This works in a small village where everyone knows everyone," one of them said. "But can it scale? Can you maintain this level of cooperation and trust in larger communities?" Thomas didn't have a good answer. He knew that what they had built in Aldermere depended on personal relationships, on the bonds forged through shared suffering and shared recovery. Whether that could be replicated in larger, more anonymous settings, he genuinely didn't know. But Eleanor, listening to the conversation, spoke up. "It doesn't have to scale all at once," she said. "It can spread village by village, community by community, each one adapting the model to fit their own needs and circumstances. That's already happening in the neighboring villages. Give it time. Let it grow organically rather than trying to impose it from above." The officials nodded thoughtfully and made notes. Thomas wasn't sure anything would come of it. Government interest often led nowhere, but the conversation itself felt significant. The fact that people in power were paying attention to what a small rural village had accomplished suggested that perhaps the post-war world might be different after all, that perhaps the common people who had borne the war's cost might finally have some say in shaping the peace. As autumn approached once more, Thomas found himself taking stock of how far he had come. 2 years ago, he had been alone in these fields, paralyzed by grief and guilt, unable to imagine a future that held anything but more loss. Now he had a wife, a daughter, a thriving cooperative, a community of friends and neighbors who depended on him and whom he could depend on in turn. The nightmares still came sometimes, but less frequently now, and they no longer had the power to completely devastate him. He had learned to live with them, to accept that some part of him would always be back in those trenches, but that didn't mean he couldn't also be here, fully present in this life he was building. On their first wedding anniversary, Thomas and Eleanor walked through the wheat fields at sunset, just as they had done the night he proposed. Hope was with them, strapped to Eleanor's chest in a sling, her dark eyes taking in the golden grain swaying in the evening breeze. "Do you remember how terrified you were?" Eleanor asked, smiling at the memory. "When you asked me to marry you, you looked like you were about to face a firing squad." Thomas laughed, surprised that he could find humor in the memory. "I was terrified. I was convinced you'd say no, that I'd ruined our friendship, that I'd revealed myself to be a complete fool." "You were a fool," Eleanor said affectionately. "But you were my fool, and look what we've built together." Thomas looked around at the fields, at the farmhouse in the distance, with smoke rising from its chimney, at the village beyond, where lights were beginning to appear in windows. He looked at his wife and daughter, at this small, perfect family he had somehow been blessed enough to have, and he felt a gratitude so profound it almost hurt, a recognition of how close he had come to missing all of this, how easily he might have let despair win, might have squandered the gift of survival on bitterness and regret. "I'm glad I survived," he said quietly, surprising himself with the words. It was the first time he had been able to say them without qualification, without guilt or shame attached. "I'm glad I made it home. I'm glad I get to have this life with you." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, careful not to jostle the baby. "So am I," she whispered. "So am I." They stood there as the sun set, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, as the autumn wind whispered through the wheat, and Thomas felt at peace in a way he had not known since before the war, a deep, abiding peace that came not from the absence of pain, but from the presence of purpose, from the knowledge that his life mattered, that the struggles and sorrows he had endured had led him to this moment, to this family, to this home. The seasons turned as they always did. Winter came again, and then spring, and then summer. Hope grew and changed, reaching her first milestones, taking her first steps, speaking her first words. The cooperative continued to expand and evolve. Eleanor reopened the village school, teaching a new generation of children to read and write and think critically about the world. Thomas's leg never fully healed, and the nightmares never completely stopped. There were hard days, days when the weight of memory felt unbearable, days when he looked at Hope playing in the garden and felt the crushing guilt of knowing that Billy Hartley would never see his own children play, that Jack Morrison would never hold his sons again. But there were more good days than bad now, days when work felt satisfying rather than exhausting, days when laughter came easily, days when the future seemed bright with possibility. And Thomas learned that this was what healing looked like, not the erasure of wounds, but the gradual building of a life large enough to contain both grief and joy, both memory and hope, both the weight of the past and the promise of tomorrow. Years would pass. More children would come. The cooperative would continue to grow, becoming a model for rural communities across England. Eleanor would become a beloved teacher, shaping young minds and helping to build a generation that valued cooperation over competition, community over individualism. Thomas would grow old, watching his fields change with the seasons, would sit on his porch in his later years and tell his grandchildren stories about the farm, about the village, about the people who had rebuilt their lives from the ruins of war. But that was all still to come. For now, in this autumn after the Great War, it was enough to stand in the twilight with the people he loved, to feel the solid earth beneath his feet, to know that he had survived not just the war, but its aftermath, that he had found his way through the darkness back to light, back to life, back to hope. The road had been long and hard. The cost had been terrible. The scars would never fully fade. but standing there in the gathering dusk, with his wife beside him and his daughter in her arms, Thomas Ashford knew with absolute certainty that the journey had been worth it, that every painful step had led him exactly where he needed to be, that this moment, this precious, ordinary, miraculous moment, was everything he had been fighting for all along. And as the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky above the peaceful English countryside, Thomas closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer of gratitude for Eleanor, for Hope, for his neighbors and friends, for the land beneath his feet, for the chance to build something beautiful from the ruins, for the privilege of being alive, for the gift of this autumn after the Great War, and for all the seasons that would follow.